Listen closely to the wind tonight. It's not just the breath of the Wyoming high desert. It's the cold, eternal echo of judgment. For Clara Hayes, the town of Solitude Pass was no refuge. It was a cage crafted from gossip and malice. 3 long years had passed since the news arrived, or rather, the lie arrived, about her late husband, Arthur. Captain Hayes, he died a hero in the border conflicts. Yes, but the story that took root in this remote, unforgiving town was far darker. Betrayal, cowardice. They whispered that he'd abandoned his men. And though the official army inquiry cleared his name, the stain of that lie was permanent. It was a shroud wrapped around Clara and her 2 small children. The shame was a physical burden. Every passing week added another layer of weariness to Clara's soul. She would walk the boardwalk, head held high, yet feel every single stare. The women at the mercantile would clutch their bolts of calico, turning away just as she entered, their silence louder than any shout. The men, gathered outside the saloon, would touch their hats, an antique gesture of courtesy, a half-second too late, a habit of respect disconnected from their actual feeling. They looked at her not with pity, but with a cold, superior disappointment. Her children were paying the true price. Finn, 10 years old and fiercely loyal, had been forced to learn the currency of cruelty. He'd stopped going to the one-room schoolhouse after a gang of older boys cornered him behind the livery stable. When Clara found him that day, his nose bleeding, his lips split, he hadn't cried. He just stared up at her, the confusion and hurt in his young eyes cutting her deeper than any knife. "They said Pa killed his own men, Mama. Is that true?" Clara had no lie that could comfort him, and no truth that wouldn't utterly break him. She could only rock him until the tremors subsided. Little Lila, 6, with her bright, trusting eyes, was the family's last flicker of innocence. But even she was beginning to sense the toxic atmosphere. She noticed how the older children scattered when she approached, how invitations to birthday parties vanished, replaced by the preacher's wife's offer of extra prayers for the unfortunate Hayes family. The isolation was a slow, steady erosion of their spirit. Clara spent her nights scrubbing the small boarding house kitchen she rented, her hands raw, her shoulders aching. She baked bread and sold it by noon, fueling her work with sheer, bone-deep necessity. Yet the strength was leaving her. Inside her chest, she felt a profound, chilling silence, the slow, steady cracking of a heart that was giving way underfoot, like ice thinning over a dark river. The breaking point arrived on the first Monday of Advent. She overheard Mrs. Albright, the banker's wife, speaking in a low, conspiratorial tone. Honestly, if she had any decency, she'd move on. It ain't fit for them children to grow up under that cloud. She's clinging to a dead traitor's name. That night, Clara finally let go. She packed what little remained. The canvas trunk was filled with necessities, the 2 thickest quilts, her father's worn Bible, a tin of flour, and the locket with Arthur's smiling portrait. But she also found the faded, slightly water-stained letter she had written him, the week before he died. It contained a simple, desperate promise to leave Solitude Pass and start a new life with him once he came home. It was a promise never fulfilled, never burned, and now it was the only direction she had left. Before the sky showed the first hint of gray, she was in the yard. The air stung her lungs. Finn appeared solemn and quiet, carrying Arthur's old heavy rifle, empty, but enough to make the boy stand taller. Lila shuffled out, clutching her ragdoll. "Where are we going, Mama?" Lila whispered, her voice a small sound in the vast cold. "South," Clara said, her voice firm, resolute. "Toward the Grizzly Claw Peaks. We are going to a place that will let us forget what other people think." By the time the sun reluctantly crested the horizon, they were small specks on the frozen prairie. Solitude Pass was already shrinking behind them, its church steeple fading into the pale, indifferent sky. Clara didn't look back. She knew with chilling certainty that towns like that only ever looked backward. She was done with their history. She was done with their shame. She was setting her family free, even if freedom meant heading straight into the unknown wilderness. The road south was little more than a memory, a faint indentation left by previous wagons, now quickly being buried beneath the accumulating white powder. The world around them was immense, desolate, and blindingly white. The familiar lines of the landscape, the fences, the distant groves of pine, vanished, leaving the earth and sky blended into a seamless, indifferent gray. The mare, old and weary, labored with every step. Her breath exploded in white plumes in the frigid air, and the wagon's constant, groaning creak was the only sound the wind did not immediately devour. Finn sat beside Clara, rigid and silent, wrapped in his father's oversized coat. Lila huddled beneath the quilts in the back, her small body trembling despite the wool. Clara kept her back straight, her jaw locked. Frost gathered on her lashes, and her fingers, wrapped around the reins, were numb blocks of pain. She had to remain the anchor. If she showed weakness, if she allowed her fear to surface, the children would be lost before the snow could claim them. By midday, the cold became a living entity. The clouds thickened, pressing low and heavy, sealing the sky. The snow returned, not as lazy flakes, but as a vicious, sideways assault, driven by a wind that seemed to possess teeth. It screamed across the open plain, biting through layers of wool and skin. The mare snorted in alarm, her ears pinned back, slowing her pace to a desperate crawl. Clara whispered her prayer again, fierce and ragged. "Just a few more miles, Lord. Just a few." But it seemed the heavens were deaf or simply closed to her plight. God, it seemed, was silent today. As the late afternoon light failed, they hadn't seen a single sign of life. No wisp of smoke, no flicker of lamplight, nothing but the howling wind. The horizon vanished, and the very concept of direction became meaningless. Then, with a jarring lurch and a desperate scream from the mare, the wagon sank. It was trapped fast in a hidden drift, buried to the axles. Finn scrambled down, his small boots instantly sinking up to his knees in the snow, and strained his shoulder against the rough wood. It wouldn't move. The mare thrashed, pulling at the harness until Clara feared the worn leather would snap. "Leave it," Clara commanded, her voice thin but absolute. She knew the time for sentimentality was long past. They took only the vital necessities, a blanket each, the Bible wrapped in oilskin, and the small tin lantern. The rest of their belongings, the last fragile remnants of their old life, she abandoned to the drift. The cold, she knew, had teeth, and she couldn't afford to slow down. The snow intensified, stinging their exposed faces like handfuls of sand, filling their footprints before the next step was taken. Lila began to whimper softly, and Finn's voice was thin as a thread, swallowed by the wind. "Mama, we need to stop." Clara looked around. There was only impenetrable darkness, only the storm's furious, suffocating rage. Then, far ahead, she saw it, a faint, almost imperceptible glimmer through the white chaos. Like a distant star struggling to be seen, it was the slightest pulse of light, like a candle shielded behind a thick curtain of snow. She immediately suspected it was a mirage, a trick of the exhausted mind. But hope, reckless and blinding, surged through her veins, overriding all reason. "Come on," she said, gripping Finn's hand so tightly it hurt. We walked toward the light. They stumbled on, each yard feeling like a mile, their energy fading with every step. The light remained, a faint, amber beacon in the absolute terror of the storm. By the time they reached the source, the light had dimmed, muffled by the sheer force of the blizzard. It was a rough, lonely cabin, snow packed high against the threshold. Clara raised her numb fist and knocked once, twice, then again, harder, pleading not just with the man inside, but with fate itself. The door opened just a crack, spilling a stream of precious, warm light across the ice. Standing there was a man, tall, broad-shouldered, with skin the color of dark, rich earth, his black hair tied back. His eyes were dark, ancient, and utterly unreadable, the kind of eyes that had witnessed more suffering than hope. He didn't speak. The relentless wind howled its argument between them. "We're lost," Clara managed, her voice cracking. "Please, my children." For a long, agonizing moment he only looked. His gaze shifted past her, finally settling on Finn, clutching the lantern, and on Lila, half asleep and trembling in her mother's arms. The quiet assessment, the lack of surprise, was almost unnerving. Then his voice emerged, quiet, steady, almost rough from disuse. "There is a fire inside," he said. "Come in before the cold takes you. The door swung wide, and Clara Hayes stepped out of the life she knew, into the warmth, and into the silent, complex world of the man who did not yet know he was about to save her. The door swung wide, and Clara stepped over the threshold, pulling her shivering children past the cold and into an atmosphere that felt like another world entirely. The silence of the cabin was immense, yet it was not the terrifying silence of the storm. This was a warm silence, broken only by the aggressive crackle and hiss of the fire in the stone hearth. The air was rich and complex. The heavy scent of wood smoke mingled with dried herbs Clara couldn't name, the sharp, clean aroma of fresh-cut pine, and the musky, wild smell of tanned hide and venison. It was a masculine, solitary scent, but in that moment, it was the smell of salvation. The man, whose name she now learned was Talon, secured the latch. He pushed the heavy, rough-hewn door against the wind's persistent moan until the latch caught with a solid thud. The storm was suddenly muted, transformed into a dull, distant roar. Clara felt the exhaustion hit her like a physical blow. Her knees felt weak, but she forced herself to action, gently guiding Lila to sit near the stovepipe, unwrapping the blankets from her shoulders. Lila's cheeks were raw and bright pink, her lips trembling uncontrollably. Finn, ever the soldier, stood near the door, his eyes dark, watchful, and intensely curious, fixed on Talon. He still clutched the empty rifle, a useless defense in this situation, but a necessary comfort. Talon moved with a shocking economy of effort. He was tall, his frame powerful and broad, but his movements were quiet, almost fluid. His moccasins made no sound on the packed earth floor. When he spoke, it was low and steady, a voice that commanded attention without rising above a conversational tone. "You can set the little one by the stove," he instructed. "There is stew in the pot." "It is venison." "Eat before it cools." Clara hesitated. Her pride, which had kept her upright through 3 years of shame, warred with her children's need. "We don't want to take what's yours. We can pay eventually." Talon cut her off with a slow, deliberate shake of his head. His eyes, dark as wet earth, conveyed a simple truth that transcended politeness. "There is more where it came from," he said. His words were not an offer of charity, but a statement of fact about survival in this place. As he reached for the heavy iron pot suspended over the fire, Clara noticed the deep, faded scars lining his forearms. They were wide, uneven marks, possibly old burns, or perhaps the unmistakable traces of iron shackles, a mark of being owned, captured, or severely punished. She looked away instantly, feeling the weight of years of suffering on his shoulders, realizing that this man too was an exile, marked by the savage judgment of the world. The stew was thick with beans, dried vegetables, and rich dark meat. It was simpler than anything Clara used to cook, yet it was richer, warmer, and more nourishing than anything she had tasted in months. Lila ate without lifting her eyes, every spoonful clumsy with hunger and speed. Finn sat beside her, consciously trying to slow down, eating like a man who wasn't sure when his next meal might come. Clara watched Talon, who had settled onto a stool near the hearth, mending a leather strap with a needle made of bone. He worked with intense focus, his entire being radiating a silent, unsettling competence. This was not a man who lived near the wilderness. He was a man who was part of it. After the children finished, Clara thanked him softly. "You saved us, Talon." Talon's gaze finally lifted. His eyes, though dark, were not cruel. "The storm saved you," he corrected. "It brought you to my door." "I merely opened it." He took a thick blanket from a peg on the wall. "You can sleep by the fire," he said. "There is room enough." "And you?" Clara asked, her voice low. "I'll keep watch." Clara wanted to argue, to insist on a rotation, but her body was trembling with exhaustion, and the immense weight of responsibility she had carried for 3 years suddenly felt too heavy. She surrendered. She spread the blanket for the children, laying Lila closest to the soothing heat of the fire. Finn insisted on staying up, but within minutes, his head drooped against his mother's shoulder, his grip on the rifle loosening in sleep. The rhythmic popping of the fire, the distant moan of the wind, and the steady, quiet presence of Talon folded around her. And there, in the small, warm silence of the exile's cabin, Clara Hayes closed her eyes. For the first time since the news of Arthur's death, she felt profoundly, absolutely safe. Safe enough to allow herself to be vulnerable. Safe enough to simply stop running. When Clara woke, the grey light of morning filtered through the window slats. The storm was still raging, a white chaos outside the glass, thicker than before. Talon was exactly where he said he would be, by the door, sharpening his knife, his posture still, almost meditative. He had not slept. "You didn't sleep," she stated, pulling her shawl tighter. He shrugged once. "I've had practice." Finn stirred, blinking the sleep from his eyes. Talon confirmed the bad news. Worse now. "You won't get far until it breaks." Clara's heart sank, but the panic was muted, contained by the solid walls and Talon's quiet presence. Clara settled into the forced waiting, watching the subtle ways Talon's solitude began to yield to the children's needs. Finn, desperately seeking an anchor, shadowed him through every chore. Talon rarely offered praise, but the quiet nods of approval. The slight shift in his posture when Finn successfully split kindling. These were a new safe language for the boy. Lila, meanwhile, continued her gentle, relentless interrogation. "Why do you live up here alone? Do you ever get lonely?" Talon, after 5 years of unbroken silence, found himself slowly, reluctantly answering. He explained why he wore his hair long, a tradition his mother had taught him. "A man's spirit lives in his hair," he told Lila. "What happened to your mama?" Lila asked. "She went where the good dreams live," Talon replied, looking into the fire. Lila, referring to Arthur, murmured, "Mine too. Mama says he's in heaven." Talon simply nodded. "That's another name for the same place." Clara watched these exchanges with a growing warmth and a profound sense of gratitude. The children recognized kindness, even when it was wrapped in quiet stoicism. That evening, after supper, while Clara mended a tear in Finn's coat and Talon whittled a piece of cedar, he broke the long, comfortable silence. "Your husband's name was Arthur Hayes," he said, his voice low and level. Clara looked up quickly, her pulse leaping. "You knew him." Talon's knife stilled, his eyes fixed on the wood. "Long enough. I was a scout for his regiment once. They called me the Red Ghost because I could move through the canyon lands unseen. But when my people learned I rode for the U.S. Army, I became a ghost to them too. Arthur was the only white man who didn't treat me like dirt. He gave me water when the others wouldn't share words. He said no man deserved to die of thirst." Clara swallowed hard, her throat tight with emotion. "He never told me any of this." "Maybe he wanted to protect you," Talon suggested. "Or maybe he wanted to forget." He took a slow drag from a slender pipe, the scent of sweetgrass curling like a veil between them. "I was there the day they died," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "He told me to ride east, warn the others. I did. When I came back, the ambush was over. He didn't cause it. He rode into it because he was following orders. He survived the bullet. But he had to carry the guilt of the living, the guilt of being the only one to walk away. The finality of the truth, spoken by this impartial witness, erased years of doubt and whispered accusations. Talon confirmed everything Clara knew in her heart. Arthur was a good man. Talon looked toward the dark window, his eyes filled with years of pain. "Forgetting doesn't work. The dead don't like to be left behind." Clara looked at him, at the deep lines around his mouth, the stillness in his shoulders, the ache buried beneath years of self-imposed exile. "You live with ghosts too, don't you?" Daishi asked. He met her gaze unflinching. "Every night," Clara acted instinctively. She reached across the small table, across the firelight, and took his hand. His skin was rough, calloused, intensely human. "Then maybe," she said, her voice soft but sure, "we can share their company." For the first time in his 5 years of solitude, Talon did not pull away. The contact was small, but the connection was absolute, a silent promise forged in shared sorrow. The intimate moment of shared grief cemented a silent bond between Clara and Talon. The days that followed were no longer about simple survival. They were about a delicate, tentative form of thriving. Talon's routines, the quiet work of chopping wood, mending snares, fetching water, became the bedrock of Clara's existence. Her constant, gnawing anxiety, the tension that had been a permanent fixture in her shoulders, began to ease, replaced by the profound, unfamiliar comfort of his presence. The children in particular flourished. Finn, proud to be Talon's apprentice, learned the quiet competence of the wilderness. Talon taught him to read the land, to track rabbit prints, two small ovals too close together, and to move through the snow without waste. Lila, meanwhile, continued to charm the exile. One afternoon, Talon returned from the ridge with a deer over his shoulder, and a genuine, rough-hewn sound of laughter escaped him. He carried Lila on his shoulders, and Finn ran behind, dragging a branch like a proud hunter's spoils. Clara met them at the door. "Looks like you've conquered half the mountain," she observed. "Only the best half," Talon replied, setting Lila down. Their eyes met, and in that shared look, something passed that was far deeper than gratitude. It was a flicker of belonging. On the third day of calm, the weather shifted definitively. Sunlight, bright and sharp, poured through the window slats. The sky was an endless cleansing blue. The snow began its retreat, melting along the eaves with a steady musical drip. The cabin creaked, waking from a long sleep. Talon opened the door, inhaling the new air. "It's over," he said simply. Clara knew the implications instantly. Their temporary refuge had an expiration date. She found herself paralyzed. Her supplies were thin, her money almost gone. But the fear that truly gripped her wasn't of hunger. It was of solitude past, of the cold eyes, the whispers, the fear she knew would return and instantly choke the life and laughter from her children. Lila tugged at her skirt, her eyes wide. "Mama, are we staying?" "I don't know, darling. When the trail is safer, we will travel. But I like it here," Lila insisted. "It's warm." "Talon is strong." Finn's voice was sharper, betraying his new confidence. "We're safe here, Mama. Talon said he'd teach me to ride when the ground dries." He looked at her, his expression mirroring the accusation she feared most. "You're scared they'll talk again." "You're scared of what people think." His words were a hammer blow because they were true. She had spent years letting the world define her worth, her direction, her family's entire existence. Now, even her 10-year-old son could see it. Talon returned from chopping wood, the air in the cabin heavy with the argument she hadn't finished. He looked from her face, etched with indecision, to the small half-packed trunk. "The trail is clear," he stated. Clara turned to him, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know what to do anymore." Talon nodded, understanding the paralyzing fear that held her. He had lived under the tyranny of the tribe's judgment too. He didn't offer advice or pressure her. He simply looked her in the eye, offering the most profound freedom he possessed. "Then stay until you know." The logs popped, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the night was holding its breath. Clara realized that the storm had locked them together. But what held them now was far more fragile and far more powerful. The beginning of a home, built on a shared refusal to let the past or the world dictate their future. The peace was deceptive, a fragile bubble ready to burst. It did so 3 mornings later. The air felt unnaturally still, the quiet before a violent storm. Talon sensed the disturbance instantly. He stood at the door, eyes narrowed, focused on a faint dust cloud rising above the lower ridge. "Riders," he announced, his voice low, controlled. 3 of them. One rides heavy, like he's carrying the weight of the town's authority. Clara felt a cold, familiar dread settle in her stomach. Marcus Hale. Her cousin, the merchant, the deacon, the man who represented everything narrow, cruel, and powerful in Solitude Pass. She knew he wouldn't let her escape quietly. Her flight was a scandal he couldn't ignore. "Go inside." "Keep the children away from the windows," Talon commanded. "No," Clara said, surprising both herself and him. "If he came for me, I'll meet him. They won't see me run again." The riders crested the hill just as she stepped onto the porch. Marcus Hale dismounted first, stocky, red-faced, his expensive coat looking ludicrously out of place against the wilderness. 2 men followed, armed with carbines, their faces hard and expressionless. "Well, well," Marcus drawled, sweeping off his hat with fake courtesy. "So it's true. My sweet cousin living out here, shacking up with a savage. Finn appeared behind the doorframe, his face pale but determined. Talon moved, a subtle, powerful shift, ensuring his body entirely blocked the boy from view. Clara met Marcus's stare, her heart pounding against her ribs. "Why are you here, Marcus?" "Because the town won't suffer this kind of scandal. You and the young ones lying down with the very kind your husband died fighting." "Arthur died trying to make peace, not war," Clara countered, finding her voice surprisingly steady. "And you will watch your words when you speak of this man." Talon said nothing, but his hand drifted toward the knife at his belt. His silence only inflamed Marcus. "You don't scare me, Apache." "The law's behind me. You've got no claim on her." Talon took one slow, deliberate step forward, his shadow falling across Marcus. "She is under my roof." "That's claim enough." Lila, sensing the escalating danger, clung to Clara's skirt. Marcus's face turned crimson with rage. "Don't test me!" He turned to his hired guns. "Take the children. She'll follow." Before they could even move, Finn darted forward, placing his small body in front of his mother. "Leave us alone!" As one of the men reached out, his hand rough and impatient, Talon moved faster than thought. He intercepted the man's arm, twisted with shocking speed, and shoved him back toward the horses. The carbine discharged with a deafening crack that seemed to momentarily stop the world. The bullet struck the porch post, splintering wood inches from Finn's head. Lila screamed, a high, piercing sound of pure terror. Clara's blood turned to ice. Marcus shouted, "Enough!" But Talon already had his hunting knife drawn. He didn't rush or rage. His stance was coiled, controlled, utterly lethal. "Stop!" Clara cried, stepping directly into the terrifying space between the armed men and Talon. "Kaelin, please!" For a heartbeat, no one breathed. The gunshot's echo rolled down the valley like thunder. Then, Talon slowly lowered the knife, his eyes never leaving Marcus. His voice, when it came, was a low, terrifying command. "You will take your men and ride back down that hill. You won't come again." Marcus hesitated, the color draining from his face as he realized the depth of the commitment before him. "You think you can threaten me? You think this woman's worth losing your life over?" Talon's voice dropped, cold and quiet, echoing the conviction of the mountain itself. "She's worth living for." Marcus, defeated by conviction rather than force, spat viciously into the snow, then mounted his horse. "This isn't finished," he vowed. "No!" Clara answered, her voice now steady. Her eyes locked on Talon. "It is," as the sound of their hooves faded. Clara rushed to Talon. Blood trickled from a shallow graze on his arm where the bullet had grazed him. She tore a strip from her shawl, pressing it against the wound. Her fingers brushed his warm, solid skin. "You could have killed him," she whispered. "I wanted to," he admitted, his chest heaving with exertion. "But that would have made him right about me." Clara looked at her children, Finn, shaky but defiant. Lila clutching her wooden falcon. She turned back to Talon, saw the storm in his eyes, and knew exactly where her truth lay. "I've been hiding my whole life," she said. "I'm done running." She reached out and took his hand, closing her fingers around his rough ones. "Whatever comes," she vowed, "we face it here, together." The space between the cabin and the receding snow held the palpable aftermath of their commitment. The splintered porch post stood as a permanent scar, a visible testament to the boundary they had defended. Talon's decision, to choose the risk of life over the safety of exile, had forged a final, unbreakable connection with Clara. The children, witnessing the raw ferocity of his protection, saw him not just as a man, but as the enduring center of their safety. In the days that followed, the atmosphere shifted from defense to creation. The quiet man was tireless. He and Finn worked on the wagon, repairing the damage from the drift. Talon began the frame for a new shed, planing the rough wood of the cabin until the interior gleamed. He was building not just structures, but a future. Clara, meanwhile, baked bread with a renewed joy, no longer fueled by necessity, but by the love of providing for her small, hard-won family. Then came the final, inexplicable tie cutter. A week after the confrontation, old Moses, the trapper, passed through and delivered a letter. It was from Marcus Hale. Clara's hands trembled, expecting a legal threat or a final, vicious curse. Instead, inside was a folded deed to the land surrounding the cabin, along with a single grudging line written in ink that seemed to have bled from deep water. If you've found peace, keep it. I've made the land yours. Clara showed it to Talon, tears welling. The deed was not a gift of generosity, but an admission of defeat. The land, which had been the catalyst for so much of the West's cruelty, was now legally theirs. He gave it to us, she whispered. Talon read the words, his jaw tight, then slowly released a long breath. Then the land finally belongs to the right people. Clara looked up at him, her heart overflowing. So do we. 3 days later, they formalized their commitment. There would be no white dress, no preacher, and no congregation. Their wedding would be a ceremony of the earth. They stood by the creek, the water running cold and bright over the stones. Talon had carved 2 simple bands from fragrant cedar, smooth and warm beneath her touch. Old Moses, the trapper, presided, his face weathered and wise. "Ain't no church can bless you better than the ground under your feet," he said, his voice rough but gentle. "If you tend it right, it'll remember your name long after the rest of us are gone." Finn stood tall and solemn beside his mother, a proud witness. Lila scattered the few tiny, defiant wildflowers she'd found poking through the snow. When Talon slipped the cedar ring onto Clara's finger, his hand shook just once, a tiny tremor betraying the magnitude of his vow. "Guess that makes it official," he murmured. Clara smiled through her tears. "I think it was official the day you opened your door." Talon leaned forward and kissed her, a kiss that was initially careful, then certain, cementing their bond under the indifferent, yet benevolent sky. Behind them, the creek sang its ancient, eternal song, and the children cheered. That evening, they ate outside for the first time, at a rough-hewn table Talon had built under the budding aspens. The air smelled of wood smoke, honey-brushed bread, and thawing earth. They shared stories, not of the old life, but of Arthur, integrating his memory into their new beginning. Talon listened, nodding quietly, a permanent, powerful figure who had finally, truly, come home. The cabin was no longer a temporary refuge. It was the foundation of the family they chose to be. Spring didn't arrive with a sudden rush. It crept in, shy and beautiful, like a gift slowly revealed. The last stubborn drifts of snow melted into the creek, feeding the valley until it shimmered with the intense, vital green of new life. The hills came alive with color, the brilliant purple of lupine, the shocking orange of Indian paintbrush, the delicate blue of flax. The air itself seemed cleaner, lighter, purged of the winter's cruelty and the town's spite. The cabin no longer smelled of loneliness and smoke. It smelled of Clara's fresh-baked bread, sun-warmed pine, and the hopeful sweetness of sap dripping from the trees. Every evening the 4 of them sat on the porch steps, watching the sun pour gold across the valley, now their valley, their land, their truth. The children were transformed. Finn rode the mare bareback along the creek, his old shame replaced by the confidence of competence. Lila followed him, her laughter ringing out, high and bright, clutching her wooden falcon. Clara would watch them, her sewing forgotten in her lap, often catching herself waiting for the old anxieties to return, the guilt, the fear, the heavy weight of the world's opinion. But it never came. Snow Creek had buried all that under its wide, merciful silence. Talon joined her one afternoon, wiping sweat and sawdust from his hands. Behind him, the shed was complete, the fence lines repaired, the cabin walls gleaming. "The land's been sleeping long enough," he said, his mouth curving into that rare, true grin. "Time it woke up. And you?" Clara asked, handing him a mug of black coffee. He took a slow sip, his dark eyes fixed on the distant ridge. "I'm still learning," he admitted. "But I'm not running." Weeks passed. The garden sprouted rows of corn and beans. Clara no longer felt like a fugitive. She felt rooted. One evening, after the summer heat had eased, they sat by the creek, the air thick with the scent of clover and sweetgrass. Fireflies winked in the reeds. Talon lifted Lila onto his lap, his arms strong and permanent around her. Talon broke the long, comfortable silence. "You ever think about Solitude Pass?" Clara smiled. Sometimes. Mostly to remind myself what not to go back to, he nodded. The past can't hurt what's already healed. Talon then spoke softly about his people, his mother's songs, and the feel of the desert after the rain, the life that had rejected him. I miss what my old life was supposed to be, he confessed. He looked at the cabin, at the children, at Clara. But this, he declared, this feels like what it could have become. Clara rested her head against his shoulder. Their wedding ring, the simple cedar band, warm against her finger. Then maybe that's enough. It is, he confirmed. When the moon rose, she whispered, "We built something, didn't we?" "From the pieces." Talon's arm tightened around her. "No. We rebuilt it from what the world threw away." As the night deepened and the children fell asleep, Talon carried them inside. Clara lingered on the porch, listening to the creek, to the wind whispering through the pines. She was no longer running from a story. She was living one. Home was not a house or a town or a name. It was the space between two people who had refused to be defined by fear. Talon returned to the doorway, his silhouette framed by the lamplight. "You coming in?" he asked. Clara smiled, taking one last look at the wide, gentle valley beneath the silver stars. "In a minute. I just want to listen." "To what?" "To everything that's finally quiet." He stepped out, wrapped his arm around her, and together they watched the moon climb higher. And there, in that vast, beautiful silence, Snow Creek breathed easy again, safe and whole, the home of a family that had finally learned the courage to stay.